All right, so next up we're looking at tangent functions. Now, tangent functions are a little bit weird in compared to sine and cosine functions. Okay, they look a little bit funny, but it's okay. We're gonna handle it. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about tangent functions is that there are certain values of your angle theta for which the tangent of that angle is undefined. Okay, so remember we talked about how tangent is sine divided by cosine? Okay, well, anytime that you have a cosine value of 0, you're going to run into a problem because if the cosine is 0, you can't divide by 0. Okay, so that means that your tangent is going to be undefined. And whenever that happens, that's going to create something called an asymptote in your graph. Okay, so asymptotes, if you remember looking at exponential functions, you have asymptotes that show up in logarithmic functions. So that's the same idea. But if you don't remember that, what an asymptote is, so an asymptote, asymptote. So an asymptote is a line that the function constantly approaches but never actually reaches. So it's constantly approaching, but it never actually gets there. Okay, and you'll see what I mean in just a second as we do an example or two. Okay, so let's talk about what this tangent graph is going to look like. So the first thing we did with sine and cosine was look at just a plain old one. So that's what this guy is. Okay, so looking at our tangent function, here's how this is going to set up. So tangent starts at 0, 0, just like sine does. Okay, and in a regular old tangent function, your period is going to be either 360 or 2 pi. So 2 pi, that's the end of my period. At the end of your period, you're going to be back on that midline. And again, like sine, halfway in between, you're going to be back on your midline. Okay, so far we're starting the same way as we did with sine. But here's the weird thing. Where in a sine graph, we'd have a point up here, halfway between these two. In a tangent graph, that's where your asymptote's going to fall. So halfway between these guys, that's where your asymptote falls. And we always put dashed vertical lines or horizontal lines for asymptotes. And then same thing here, halfway between these two is where your other asymptote's going to fall. Okay? So then following this pattern, we can kind of say, oh, okay, well then there's going to be another asymptote that shows up over here. And there'll be another asymptote that shows up over here. It just goes on forever in both directions, right? So you can kind of see what that's going to look like. All right, so here's the weird thing. There's going to be, it's sort of like a little different piece of this graph in each one of these little sections. So I'm going to kind of deal with this middle section first. Okay, so what's going to happen is that from this point, whatever your amplitude is, you're going to go over 1 and up whatever your amplitude is. So this one, my amplitude is just 1, so it's just 1 point up there. And then in the opposite direction, the same thing, but going down. Okay, so see, it's kind of like 3 points in a row. Okay, and then that's really kind of all you get. There's no other nice points because the next point would be on our asymptote, and that can't be a thing. So here's what happens with tangent. It's weird. Okay, where sine and cosine always bounce between 1 and -1. Okay, tangent doesn't do that. It goes between 1 and -1, but then it kind of skyrockets here. Okay, so what happens with your values is that they start going up and up and up and up and up and up and up, and it goes up infinitely. So if you could get infinitely close to this asymptote line, your tangent value would be like massive, like millions, billions we're talking about. Okay, so you get really, 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 really big values of tangent. And then the same thing going this way, but in a negative direction. You're approaching this line, you're getting super, super close to it, but never actually touching it. Okay, and that little shape that we just made, that's kind of copy and pasted in all of these little sections. So from this point, you're going to have that 1 point up and 1 point down. Okay, and then it's approaching that tangent line, but never actually touching it. Approaching the tangent line, I'm sorry, the asymptote, but never actually touching it. Same thing over here. So point here, and then we're approaching that asymptote, but never actually touching it. Okay, so that's what your tangent graph looks like. It's kind of funny looking. All right, we're not going to do too much with doing shifts and different changes with tangent graphs, but you need to make sure that you know how to do a basic one and any kind of a vertical shift. Okay, so looking at this guy right here, we can see from looking at the end that I've got a vertical shift. Okay, so this is a vertical shift of 3. Okay, so my midline's going to be up here. Now I'm putting in a dashed line, but it's a different dashed line than what you would see for an asymptote, right? Asymptotes are invisible. This line is invisible, but an asymptote is a line you're constantly approaching. Okay, this line here is just to kind of help us orient ourselves. It's not really functioning as anything. Okay, so now this is going to be our new midline. So we're going to set up our tangent graph. So still didn't change my period. So my period's going to be 360 for this one. So my starting point starts on my midline. Okay, and then I'm going to end at the midline. Halfway between, so at 180, I'm back on the midline. And then halfway between those is where my asymptotes are going to fall. So halfway between these, there's my asymptotes. Okay, and then that gives you what you need. So now here, before on this one, I kept saying, oh, go over one block and up one block. Well, it's really just you're going halfway between this point and that asymptote, which happened to be one block here. So I should have been more clear and said you're going halfway between. So I'm going to find the point that's halfway between this point right here and this asymptote. So halfway between those two is about halfway. And that's where I'm going to go up 1, halfway between those, down 1. Okay, and then there's your asymptotes. Okay, so same thing over here, right? I know that I would go halfway between these guys and down. That's where this half of my asymptote is. I'm sorry, this half of my tangent graph. And it comes up here as well. Since that's off the graph, you don't have to put it there. But if it's easier for your brain to add it in, you are totally welcome to do that, right? Like if it's easier for your brain to say, oh, okay, well, I'd have another one over here, and then I'd have one up here, and then draw that in, you are welcome to do that. Okay, same thing over here, right? If it helps, go ahead and draw this in to give you that halfway point. So halfway between these, up, and then halfway would be down here. And there's my function. Okay, so tangent graph, it's a little funny looking. I find it the funniest looking of all the graphs. Okay, but if you're good with your vertical shifts and you're okay with memorizing the pattern, it's really not too bad.